Hi guys, it's Professor Fernandez, and today we're going to talk about Raymond Carver's Popular Mechanics. It's an interesting little story. It's a very short story. It's 2 pages, all put together, if that. And one of the things about this story that I think kind of perplexes students is um, why is there so little information? They make a lot of assumptions with the story, and sometimes I have to reel people in. So let's get started here and talk about what this story is actually about. So before we analyze the story, I want you to think about what happened to the baby and how do you know the baby. Several things could have happened to the baby. The baby could be fine. The baby could be no longer with us, or the baby could have been damaged in some way. So what makes you think that the baby did, or what happened to the baby actually happened to the baby? Um, I want you guys to think about this because there's usually an answer, and I want you to also, this is one of those times where you have to check what you want versus what you think happened. Because a lot of students say, no, the baby's fine. And I ask them, how do you know? And they can't point to anything in the story. So think about what the story is telling you, and then think about what happened to the baby. So there's tons of stuff to talk about, and I'm gonna try to go through this as quickly as possible. I don't want to waste a lot of your time with a lot of talking, but there are 4 things that we're going to investigate here: the tone of the story, the idea of minimalism, which is negative space in the story. We'll talk about that. The symbolism and the illusion in the story. There's lots of symbols. There's one huge illusion if you haven't seen it yet. And of course, we'll come back and talk about what happened to the baby. So we got to talk about who did all this chaos. And the person who did all this chaos, of course, is Raymond Carver. And this is a little bit of his stats, a little bit of his writer's purpose here. I think what's intriguing here is that he's a little bit different than all the other writers that we've studied in this course so far. He is probably one of the most realist folks. Like you could totally tell from this picture, like he's been through some life things. He's a flawed character. Like he's an alcoholic or was an alcoholic. He's had marriage problems. He's had bankruptcies. And he is not the type of person who's like an Ivy League person at all. He has had many jobs, from custodian to teaching at universities. He runs the gamut here. So he's your very average Joe Schmo, um, and writes about middle class life as he saw it in his life. So that's kind of who he is. Um, he has never written a book. So if you see a book that's a novel that says Raymond Carver, that is, don't buy it because it's false. He's had short story collections because he's a short story writer. And what he usually writes about is the common working person and the collapse of human relationships. That is what he specializes in. As you can tell, every writer specializes in a thing that we've studied in this course so far, and this is what he specializes in. He died fairly recently compared to other writers who've died not as recent. 1988. So it's been a little bit, but he's pretty modern compared to what we've studied in the past. So this story of Popular Mechanics, it's an interesting story, not only because of what happens in the actual story, but also because this version of the story is like the second version of the story. The first version of the story was called Little Things, and it was included in a collection called Where I'm Calling From, 1988, so the year that he died. The story is now called Popular Mechanics, and it was in a collection called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, published in 81. So actually, I was wrong. Popular Mechanics, this version, is the first version of the story. The second version of the story is called Little Things. I have yet to see a copy of Little Things. Every time I see this story, it's always under Popular Mechanics and it's not really under Little Things. So I don't know what the difference between Popular Mechanics and Little Things is. Um, I would imagine is not a lot of difference. I thought I had seen a copy of it a couple of years ago, but it's not there. It's not it. Um, as cool as the story is, this is not his most well-known piece. His most well-known piece is called Cathedral. I don't like that story, which is why I don't teach it. You go into a bunch of textbooks and you look for Raymond Carver, and it's usually Cathedral that's in there and not Popular Mechanics. I personally think Popular Mechanics is a better written story than Cathedral, but that's just personal preference. And you're probably wondering here about the name of this short story. And so, hey, guess what? Popular Mechanics used to be a magazine. Yay! It was definitely something that was popular around the time that Raymond Carver was doing his thing and writing his stories and being, living the writer life. So he, of course, knew about this story. It was super, super popular. It was all about science and technology. It's still technically around, but it's in another manifestation. I think it's just a website now. And so the tagline of this magazine, as we all know, taglines are arguments. See how we remember that? How we come around to these lessons? The tagline of this magazine is How Your World Works. And so when we're looking at that particular story, and how it's kind of sort of named after Popular Mechanics the magazine, we start formulating an argument here. So we could use the tagline, How the World Works, toward the story of Popular Mechanics. And that now gives it another meaning here. So we have to look at kind of what the big social issue that this author and this story is talking about. Are they talking about marriage? Are they talking about committed relationships? Are they talking about parenting? Or are they talking about humanity? And this is one of those things that you, as the reader, need to come into some sort of agreement with, between you and the story. You can easily say this is about marriage, or this is about committed relationships. Here's the thing. If you say about marriage, I need you to prove that the couple is married. Nowhere in the story does it say the couple is married. So, is it about committed relationships? Is it about parenting? Is it about humanity, who we are as humans, and how we deal with each other in times of conflict? We also need to look at tone for this story. And just a reminder, tone is the writer's attitude toward either the subject or the audience. You could either get this through diction or through word choice, or through syntax, like the order of the words. So it could be tone can be light and airy and funny, or it can be serious and heavy. Whatever the tone is, and again, you get to tone by looking at diction and looking at syntax. So either looking at the choice of words or the order of the words in a sentence or in a phrase. So by determining the tone, you can start determining what the argument is, because tone is a choice. And so what does Carver actually say about tones in his story? I did some research and found a quote from Raymond Carver about tone. And he says he likes it when there is some sense of menace in short stories. There has to be tension, a sense that something is imminent. So Raymond Carver loves him some tone. He loves having something that's kind of menacing in his story. And so when we look at Little Things / Popular Mechanics, we have that tone. We know from the very first line that something is happening and something's about to happen. And we see those by looking at the tone, looking at the diction, and reading between the lines. He's giving us clues all the while that something pretty bad's about to happen. And the tension builds and builds and builds until something does happen. So that means that for Carver, what he's not talking about is what he's talking about. So you have almost like a negative imprint. So think of it as like, if you've ever seen a photo negative, you have like the dark spots and the light spots. And then the light spots, when you print it out, are actually color, and the dark spots are actually light. And so you have a negative here. And so what he is not saying, what he has not put in the story, is what he's actually arguing. And this is actually called minimalism. What the writer's not mentioning, what he's not putting in there, what's in the negative space, means that that is what the writer is absolutely saying. And so you could compare this, or critics have compared this style to like a TV commercial. Like, oh, you just get a snippet, and that snippet's supposed to tell you about everything. There are some things you don't get in the story. You don't get names. You barely know that the baby is a boy. You don't know what led to the fight, and you don't know what happens to the end, because those things are not important. What Carver wants you to focus on is what happened from the moment the guy comes in and starts packing his stuff to the moment that and so the thing is done, right? And so the thing happened with the baby, and that's it. And what he's trying to say is about humanity, or about relationships, or about life, is happening in that 2-page story. So here is something that we need to kind of think about. Carver's stories almost always talk about cause and effect, and it's something that's kind of lends itself to minimalism very easily. What caused this? What is the effect? And he actually really leans more towards the effect, because the cause isn't really the thing, because cause lays blame, right? And so the fact that we don't know what led to this fight, like, we could just imagine what led to the fight, right? Anything could have led to this fight, and to him leaving and her cussing him out and whatnot. By wanting to know what happened, we start wanting to lay blame on people, right? We want to pick a side, and that's kind of a human instinct. By not saying what happened before, we put both characters on equal footing. And so at the end, they're both responsible for what happened to that baby. And so here's more story, or more stuff about minimalism, and it's essentially its exclusion, right? And we've just talked about that here in a minute. So here's some stuff that's not in the story. Of course, the woman and the man's name, their backstory, what happened, what led to their fighting, how they met. At one time, they were in love. They made a whole baby. They made a whole household, right? We don't know if they're married or not. We are assuming that they are, but we don't know. There are no quotation marks, if you've noticed, right? So there's no quotation marks. So the dialogue is just happening. It's mostly dialogue, this story. And so it goes back and forth and back and forth. And so that is a choice as well. Why do you think Raymond Carver didn't use quotation marks? That's up to you to decide. And we don't know the child's name. And we don't know any names because names give you attachment. So we are almost, as a reader, a judge of what's happening, right? And in order for a judge to rule fairly, they have to be detached in some way, shape, or form. There's lots of symbolism in here. Tons and tons of symbolism. And here's a reminder of what that is. It just pulls together. It's a literary technique or literary device that puts a thing, idea, or quality from the actual world to a thing, idea, or quality from another or higher world to represent it in its literal meaning. And so we've done lots of symbolism stuff before in class. Symbolism, along with diction, is doing a lot of heavy lifting here in this story. This is why this story is so short, and why I love teaching this story, is that because it's doing a lot of work with symbolism, it's doing a lot of work with diction, a lot of work with tone, and a lot of work with imagery, that you really don't have room for anything else. That it almost, because it's heavy on the literary devices, minimalism naturally happens, right? And so you have to, as a reader, glob to those ideas of symbols. And those symbols, that tone, that diction, those images, the setting is telling you what you need to know about what happened to that baby and what that argument is. So a symbol for a writer for a story like this is very deliberate. It enhances the argument. And I want you to remember there is no mistakes when it comes to writing, right? An author put that stuff in there and there is no mistake. So that is pretty much what symbol is and what symbols mean. And so there's lots of symbols here in this story. Of course, you probably have already Googled this story and you probably have already picked out some symbols. And that's great. All I'm going to say is not all of them are true. So be wise of what you believe from Google. All right, so let's talk about allusion. Here's another literary device that is happening here in this story, and it's a big one. It's a huge allusion. If you know your Bible stories, you probably picked up on this story. It is the story of King Solomon. But let's talk about allusion first. An allusion, if you remember, is a reference to a historical, mythic, or literary person, place, event, or movement, right? So it is alluding to something else. So that's how you can remember allusion. Allusion alludes to something else. So if you've noticed, this is the story of King Solomon. Two mothers say that this baby is theirs. They go to King Solomon to solve this issue. He said, all right, well, I'm going to cut the baby in half. You have one piece, you have the other piece. And the real mother says, no, she can have the baby. I don't want any harm to come to the baby. And so, of course, this is how he knows it's the real mother, because the real mother would sacrifice herself and her want for her baby. And so we have almost physically the tugging of a child in the story. That this is the King Solomon story turn on its head here. And so the idea of this King Solomon story is classified by theologians as a tale of wisdom to reveal a false truth, to define what it means to be a mother and what a mother's love is. And so that is kind of like the moral of that story, of the King Solomon story. And so you can probably apply some of that here to popular mechanics. The academicians who look at the King Solomon story look at this as folklore. Folklore meaning this is stories of which you gain insight or you gain lessons from the story. And so what we have here is the body of expressive culture shared by a particular group of people. It encompasses the traditions common to that culture, subculture, or group. So when we look at maybe the argument of this, we can look at humanity and what humanity deems as important, and the idea of a man and a woman tugging at this baby, and whoever wins the baby wins the argument. It sets up the baby as a symbol, it sets up the illusion of King Solomon, and it sets up the idea of falsehood and truth. And so neither of them are of truth, neither of them are of love. And so what does this say about humans and when we get heated? And what does this say about our ability to take care of each other and to take care of the most vulnerable? And that's something that you need to think about for yourselves. Of course, the King Solomon story isn't the only story. There is an actual story dealing with the Buddha and one of his incarnations. And it's very, very similar to the King Solomon story. And I'm going to butcher this, Yakshini, is a mother, is someone who is the shape of a woman who kidnapped the mother's baby and claimed it was hers. The sage announced a tug of war. Hint, hint. He drew a line in the ground and asked the two to stand on opposite sides of the line, one holding his feet, the other one holding the baby's hands. The one who could pull the baby's whole body beyond the line would get him. The mother, seeing how the baby suffers, released him and let this person get him. Weeping when the sage saw it, He returned the baby back to the hands of the true mother, exposed the identity of this other person, and expelled her. So that is very, very similar again to what happened in this story. So both of these are folk tales, and both of these tell about cultural norms, right? What is normal in the culture, what is normal in the tradition of the people. So what do these stories say about the culture of the people who tell it? What do they think is important? This is something we usually do in class and we talk about in class, but this is what I want you to think about, especially if you're thinking about how to approach the journal and how to approach the argument. What is this story telling about what is important in our lives? What's important in our culture? Now, again, I'm going to ask you to check what you believe. And I want you to check that, put it aside. What is this story actually saying? Because what I don't want you to do is imprint what you believe onto the story. Because that is not what Raymond Carver is saying. Right? I don't know what he's saying. Don't ask me. I'm just an English teacher. Of course, there's allegory here, and an allegory is extended metaphor. You want, when you think of allegory, I keep saying think of Zootopia. Zootopia is an allegory for racism and prejudice and so many isms. So is there an allegory here? Maybe. It's up to you to decide. I don't know. I'm just an English teacher. That's all I'm saying. And so in this short lesson, you've learned lots of things. More literary terms, I think, that you've ever learned in your life, or at least more literary terms happening in this story than I think any other story in the semester. We talked about minimalism a little bit, and we talked about allusion. And we talked about this story kind of as something that you really need to detach from. And it's a difficult story to detach from, because you kind of have to be a cold-hearted person to be like, I don't care what happened to this kid at the end, right? You're probably read it and you're probably horrified, right? And that's the exact reaction. That is the reaction that Raymond Carver wanted you to have. He wanted you to be horrified at what happened. And he wanted you to say, well, what happened? Right? Because it's not for him to say, it's for you to decide as the reader. And so he, of course, gives you hints. He has all the symbolism here. He has this huge allusion here. There's extended metaphors. You got to decide if this is an allegory. You've got this wonderful setting. You've got this tone. You've got the tension that builds. He is doing a lot in the story. It's only 2 pages, 2 short pages. So yeah, you've got a lot of things to work with, and a lot of things to that will help you up in this story. Okay, I'm done. I hope this was very helpful to you. Let me know what you think. Bye, guys.